for joining. Very much looking forward to our discussions over the coming weeks. And today really is the kickoff to the Learning Lab. So it's very much an introductory session where I'm going to walk everyone through some of the foundations and the fundamental principles around decent work, really to kind of get the conversation going and start us off on the right track. So I am going to share my screen. Here we go. Perfect. So I'm going to give a little bit of background, first of all, kind of building on what Farid said about kind of the why and the what about this Learning Lab on measuring decent work. I'll give a little bit of an introduction to myself, and then we'll really jump straight in to a part presentation and really part discussion. So I would very much urge all of you attending today and in future sessions to really contribute, ask questions, share real life examples to really get the discussion going, because I think this is really going to be as rich as we make it. And I think there's so much interesting content to discuss both today and over the coming sessions that I'd really like to hear from all of you. So first of all, just to kind of recap, really the Learning Lab here, obviously, you know, job quality, decent work, and we can get into the definitions in a second, a real growing area of focus, not just for Andy, but for impact investors, international development projects more widely. And you know, the importance of how employment can drive economic growth and well-being has always been important, but probably just re-emphasized in the minds of lots of us, particularly with the pandemic and the disruptions that's caused to people's livelihoods and job situation. Last year, and I'm sure many of you have read this, if you haven't, I'd strongly suggest reading it. Andy released a report summarizing the evidence base on job quality in small and growing businesses. It's a great synthesis and summary of the evidence, and I really would suggest you take a look at that. This Learning Lab is really aiming to build on that and to really support and help us all think through practical ways to measure job quality in the SGP sector, and really trying to enhance and exchange really knowledge among Andy members and partners and the wider community. Because in many ways, decent work, as hopefully you'll see in this first session, it conceptually, it's relatively straightforward to get your head around, to define and to understand what it is. It's much more challenging to situate that in a context and identify what a quality job looks like in a given country, a given sector. Much more complex to measure changes in the decency of employment, and even more complex to work with small and growing businesses to kind of unlock and leverage their incentives and potential to create quality employment. All of which are topics we'll address, but there is no a caveat at the beginning. There is no one single answer, one single tool, and as always in these things, context is king. So again, underlining the interactive nature, please ask questions, share your real life examples. It really is about exchanging and discussing ideas between us. So a little bit about just my background, first of all, and who I am. So as Farid said, my name is Matt Ripley. I've spent over almost 15 years now working with the International Labour Organization, both as a member of staff and as a consultant. My last role was where I led an innovation lab on how to come up with practical ways to measure job quality in small and medium enterprises. I currently work at an organization based in the UK, where I am now, called The Good Economy, and we work particularly around Sustainable Development Goal number 8. For those who don't know what that is, we'll cover that a little bit later on decent work and economic growth, particularly with investors, businesses, and capacity development support organizations to really drive improvements in more and better jobs. I'll stop there and go back to some of the other things later. I just want to I might have already put on screen the sessions, so hopefully you've all got those in your diary. I just wanted to explain the difference between some of them, and obviously everyone's welcome to attend as many as they like, and hopefully all of them, but I just wanted to walk you through the different tone and the different focus of some of these sessions. So obviously we're starting today with the first session, the kind of more introductory, kind of what is decent work, and that's really what we call one of the core sessions. That's designed, to be pretty broad and for everybody. We've got a session in a couple of weeks' time, session 4 on measuring decent work, metrics and methods, and that again is kind of aimed at both investor audiences, capacity development providers, a big sweep of different needs. The second category of sessions we've got are a little bit more targeted. So that's session 2, where we really dig deep into the investor's perspective on measuring decent work, and then session 3, which is considerations for capacity development providers. So looking at similar issues around measuring decent work, but from 2 slightly different perspectives. The third set we have are then very much kind of topic focused. So 2 sessions, one session 5 on rights, respect and cooperation in the workplace, as you'll see in a second, when I talk you through the different levels at which decent work can be conceptualized and measured. This is very much about making sure the kind of minimum standards and minimum safeguards are in place from a decent work perspective, whereas session 6, the last session, what we call beyond compliance, is about how to drive improvements and measure improvements in various aspects of kind of gainful, meaningful and fulfilling work. So going beyond the minimum to creating as much positive impact as possible. So that's the 6 sessions, and as I said, welcome to join as many as you like. Even if you're not particularly, say, an investor, I think it still might be interesting to kind of join a session on the investor's perspective, just to kind of get the full suite. But obviously, it's this is how we've designed it. But if you have any questions on the specific content of each one, please reach out to us before each session or after the end of this one, and we're happy to provide more details on the exact content, and so you can see if it's the perfect fit for you. What I want to do here is it's always challenging to start with a challenge. I think with a bad news story. I think the world needs more good news stories these days. But it definitely piques attention to start with the problems that we're all trying to address, particularly around Sustainable Development Goal number 8. And SDG 8, so the UN's global goals, I think, of all of the SDGs, number 8 has particularly become a rallying cry for practitioners working with entrepreneurs as a means of boosting kind of economic and social development. And it's probably the most aligned with Sustainable Development Goal, whether you're an investor or a capacity development provider, and that's a good thing, particularly given the scale of the challenge. And even before the pandemic struck a couple of years ago, the ILO was warning that progress in reducing unemployment globally, and there were some positive movements towards, at least on a global level, reducing unemployment levels, was really not being matched by improvements in the quality of work. And it underscored that poor working conditions are an aggregate the main global employment challenge. And that actually led the ILO, even before COVID-19, to declare that the goal of decent work for all, which is at the core of SDG number 8, is actually unrealistic for many countries at the current trajectory. So it really was an emphasis to kind of up everyone's game on trying to achieve SDG 8 targets. And the figures on the right-hand side were sometimes a bit abstract. Big figures don't mean much, but actually I think it situates that the global employment challenge is still pretty hefty. If by 2030 we're actually going to reduce the millions dying each year from occupational accidents, the 3/4 of the world with partial or no access to social security, and the number of people, particularly who are working, who have jobs but are not earning enough to support themselves or their family, living above the poverty line, so the in-work poverty or the working poor. So a pretty big scale of global employment challenge. So I guess situating that in particular Latin America context, and I know we have some organizations and individuals from outside of the region today, but obviously with the focus of the chapter, this is this is one to just situate it within not just a global challenge, but a more regional challenge, but also leveraging the opportunity, right? Because I think, again, it's easy to get stuck in the bad news stories, but there's a lot of potential to build on. And I think that's what I'd like to underscore both today and in future Learning Lab sessions as well in this series, is that this is not an impossible task. This is often about aligning incentives and focusing on win-wins, particularly in the SGB sector. And I think figuring out what those win-wins might be and how to make the most and maximize the potential of the opportunity is really important. So of course, in the global employment challenge cascades and is felt equally in Latin America, with actually above average rates of informal employment, clearly a big effect of the COVID pandemic in terms of job losses, and actually with the highest rate of people not in education, employment or training among low income groups in particular of any region in the world. And again, a hefty, not 3/4, but under half of workers and their families not protected or not extended to any kind of formal social protection mechanisms. But obviously, there's a strong opportunity, a large and potentially productive labor force. What we've seen in COVID and was happening before was the acceleration of alternative and different forms of work arrangement, which presents both opportunities and challenges from a decent work perspective, particularly digital work platforms, commonly known as the gig economy, to create employment opportunities. And actually there were, again, pre-COVID, gradual improvements in overall labour market participation, and still a way to go, but some positive signs in terms of closing the gender gap. So a way to go, but some positive signs of progress to build on. Again, for those members who might be slightly maybe not Andy members or new to the concept, just wanted to recap, the difference particularly between small and growing businesses and small and medium enterprises. So this is the Andy definition. As you'll see here, SGBs, so small and growing businesses, really commercially viable businesses around up to kind of 5 to 250 employees. And this is key, that really have significant potential and ambition for growth. So these are not necessity or subsistence entrepreneurs who are kind of running a livelihood sustaining business and just doing that to earn an income and have no growth ambitions, but really are opportunity entrepreneurs who seek to take advantage of a market opportunity. And that's important. It's something we'll come back to later on the nexus between improving decent work outcomes and improving business outcomes in small and growing businesses is one of the key features I'd like us to explore and to unpack, because it is one of the mechanisms of the market incentives, along with obviously the regulatory environment that are, I guess, the two big levers for improving decent work in the long term. So I've touched on this a little bit already. Of course, small and growing businesses are actually critical to the achievement of SDG 8. The majority of people employed around the world are employed in small and medium enterprises. And they often, in many countries, have actually have an outsized contribution to employment growth. So obviously has a really important role in creating not just job creation, but shared prosperity for all. And this was really underlined by the Andy report last year that I would suggest you read, the synthesis paper, that it's very hard to make generalizations, particularly around not just the quantity, but the quality of jobs supported by SGBs. It is very uneven. In some instances, it's actually, and in some dimensions and aspects of job quality, which we'll get to later, job quality in SGBs is actually higher than in larger multinational enterprises and large corporations. In others, it's lower. And really the first port of call is to really understand, scrutinize and support the SGB sector to figure out what's better, why, and where it's realistic to expect and support improvement over time. And I think that's really particularly important, as I said, because of the changing nature of work, that the labor force and in fact the global economy in 5 years time, even in a few years time, is very unlikely to be as it looks today. And the changing nature of work, digital platforms, the transition to a low carbon future is really creating both challenges and opportunities for decent job creation. And I think that's one of the key things to think about, is that, like measurement in general, decent work can sometimes be understood in the rear view mirror, with where people have been engaged and employed in sectors in the past. But actually, a lot about decent work is about understanding future trends and harnessing and maximizing the opportunity of those future trends. And digital transformation and the move to a low carbon future is two of those big mega or macro trends that are really important. So I'm going to give a little bit of a kind of definition of what decent work is from the International Labour Organization's decent work agenda, and then take you through a little bit about some of the, I guess, the core architecture of what decent work actually is. It's not going to be me talking all the time. Don't worry, we're going to stop in a second and love to hear, and we've got some questions as we go along to hear your challenges and situate it in your own context, and we'll have a discussion a little bit later on. But before we do, I think it's just important to kind of get some of the definitional clarity sorted up front. So the International Labour Organization, for those who don't know it, is a UN agency. It actually predates the UN. It's over 100 years old now. And it's a tripartite organization. So it has a governance structure that actually has an equal footing between governments, between employers organizations, and between workers organizations. So trade unions, and the governance is tripartite, is split between those groups. And about 20 years ago, the ILO came up with the decent work agenda, and the definition of decent work on the left-hand side there, not exactly short and concise, but important in its entirety. I'm just going to read it out because we're going to kind of unpack it and pick out some of these elements from a measurement perspective in the next half hour or so. So decent work sums up the aspirations of people in their working lives. So think of the word aspirations, have this in the back of your mind for a discussion later. It involves opportunities for work that is productive and delivers a fair income, security in the workplace, and social protection for families, better prospects for personal development and social integration, freedom for people to express their concerns, organize and participate in decisions that affect their lives, and equality of opportunity and treatment for all women and men. So yes, a big definition, lots to unpack there, and we'll get into the various ways in which that definition can be operationalized in a second. For the ILO and the way it works, actually, and this is more than just kind of organizational interest, but it is important for what decent work actually covers and doesn't cover. There is a tendency to equate decent work just to issues of job quality, but actually decent work is very interesting in the fact that it is actually about more and better jobs. It's about job quality, and job quality, obviously job inclusion, because the first pillar of the decent work agenda is actually employment creation, which is obviously all about job creation. The second, third, and fourth, rights at work, social protection, social dialogue, are much more firmly in the job quality sphere. So one of the first things to think about is that measuring decent work and decent work in general is about more and better jobs. It's about employment creation, rights at work, so social protection, social dialogue, and gender equity as a cross-cutting objective. So that's the way the ILO decent work agenda is framed, and we'll get again to what that looks like from a practical perspective in a second. And don't worry, this isn't going to be a long lecture on labour law, but again, important to understand the kind of the layering and the architecture of decent work at the global level to, I think, situate it then at a very local level. So if you start on the left-hand side, really, you have a series of mechanisms that frame the employment relationship in any given country. If you look at the international stage, you have a set of international labour standards, of which the ILO is the custodian. There are many of these, some of which have been ratified by countries, other which have not. But there are, and it's important to know from a, what is the minimum expected perspective, which we'll get to in a moment. There are there are 8 fundamental conventions that cover really 4 topics that the ILO has set out. And these cover freedom of association, so the right to kind of form and join a union, and the right to collective bargaining, so to negotiate collectively with employers, elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, the abolition of child labor, and the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. I'm sure in the back of your mind, you're already thinking, how does this fit with an SGB sector? It might make sense if you're working at Coca-Cola or Walmart and big companies. How does it work in smaller companies that are fast growing and that have 10 employees, not 10,000? This is all things we'll get to in a second. But nonetheless, there are a kind of set of lines in the sand that are very clear on kind of, the minimum expected and the fundamental principles and rights at work that form these international labor standards. That then at the national context, the governance of decent work is around obviously country-specific legislation and laws that regulate the labor market. So they often incorporate aspects of those labor standards. There'll be different titles and different names in each country, but typically covering things like national minimum wage, working time regulation, anti-discrimination, and so on. And then finally, at the micro level, we would have contracts that stipulate the rights and obligations of the worker and the employee, either individual between workers and employers or collective between unions and employers. Again, in a context where a formal employment between a worker and an employer is giving way in many modern economies to casual labor, to contract labor. It's interesting to think about in the context of SGBs what that actually means. So we'll get back to that topic again a little bit later. The last part of this, before I would love to hear some experiences about your challenges in your context, is decent work deficits. So there's many different ways to cut decent work, as I said before, around the kind of more better jobs perspective, and this is the way that the ILO frames its decent work deficits from the perspective of workers. So what is the real challenge that a group of workers is facing in a particular context? Is it lack of employment opportunities? Is it to do with job quality? So this is kind of 2 through 8. That's everything from low earnings to unsociable hours, to unsafe work environment, to issues that really can only be conceptualized at more national systems level, which are things like social protection and workers and employers representation. So that's a way of kind of unpacking some of the elements of the decent work agenda. What I'd love to hear from you all, just in terms of context, really, is kind of what are the main decent work deficits in the country where you work or where your program operations are. And we'll also do a quick poll, which should pop up on screen in a second, where you can select one or more of the decent work deficits. And it would just be great to kind of see what are the challenges where you work. I cannot actually see the poll, but that could just be me.
We can't either, Matt.
Okay.
We're trying here, just 1 minute, Matt. Sorry for that.
If not, we can either skip over this one and maybe get it sorted for the next question in a minute.
Just 1 more minute, Matt, and then we can just move forward. Yes, please. Let's just move on.
Okay. There's a couple of questions later. If we can't get the slides working, what I'll suggest is we just unmute and contribute. Here, this one does require more of a list, so let's skip on until the next discussion point. Right. So what I wanted to say here was that if you'll have noticed in the slide before last on the decent work deficits, they were quite factual. They were around things like safety and health, things like wages. We call the kind of the tangibles of decent work. There is obviously, as anyone who obviously all of us who are working know, that so the intangible elements of jobs and of employment is actually a really important topic to think about. And here we can think around engagement. So kind of the extent to which a worker feels a sense of attachment to the organization he or she works for, believes in its goals and supports its values. And there's lots of definitions of employee engagement out there, but really it's around a much more subjective interpretation of decent work. And engaged employees work with passion, feel a profound connection to their company, they drive innovation and move the organization forward, is the Gallup definition. And again, going back to the topic we'll keep touching on, the kind of the value for SGBs, how to unlock the incentives in SGBs themselves to kind of keep track of and drive improvements in job quality. It's really important to kind of think about that connection between business success and the growth of SGBs and not just treating workers well, but having highly engaged employees. And we have drivers of engagement on the right-hand side there. There's many and are very contextual. But as you'll see there, they're things that are pretty tricky to measure and a lot harder to get at than number of accidents and injuries in a workplace. Work autonomy, task variety, feeling of valued, very subjective things. So again, we're not going to go into the solutions today as much as trying to give you the lenses of which to interpret and think about some of the core job quality and decent work measurement challenges. So we talked about decent work as a concept and the ILO's decent work agenda. But what's a decent job? And that term is often used quite a lot about kind of supporting decent jobs, creating decent jobs. And actually, funnily enough, there is no really generally accepted definition of a decent job. The ILO has not come up with one, precisely because it's actually quite hard to contextualize and to come up with one single definition of what a job, an individual's job, looks like and whether that's decent or not. So think of decent jobs of a continuum and not a threshold. And I think that's one of the measurement challenges we'll keep coming back to, is, how do you actually think about whether an individual job that's being supported in an SGB is decent or not? And one of the ways of getting around some of the threshold discussions, or the binary discussions, is or is not decent, is to think along a continuum, kind of less decent to more decent. And one of the ways of categorizing that is around different types of work that people do, whether it's in exploitative work, so conditions of modern slavery, child labor, or hazardous. So as you'll see, there's a strong crossover there to those ILO fundamental principles. Whether that work is compliant with national legislation, so it's fair treatment, non-discrimination, safe and healthy workplaces, or whether it goes beyond compliance to fulfilling work, so offer opportunities for training and development, for career and work progression, and compensation and benefits that allow for wealth creation over time. So just to have in your back of your mind, kind of thinking of the ways in which decent work, or particularly decent jobs, can be conceptualized. And we'll come back to this later, and the levels of which decent work can actually be measured from the kind of continuum of less decent to more decent, exploitative, compliant, or fulfilling. So why is decent work relevant to SGBs? I've kind of teased a few of the reasons why, and not just from a kind of a social responsibility standpoint, but from a business perspective here. We can almost talk about two reasons, from risk mitigation to value creation. So see, with Disengaged employees with low morale and motivation tends to result in low productivity. Not having compliant work or particularly exploitative work can lead to legal or regulatory issues, whether that's a social license to operate or actually fines, and in some jurisdictions, civil or personal liability for company directors. Business interruptions, strikes, are obviously an extreme example. Staff turnover with low employee satisfaction can lead to high staff turnover, which can lead to high costs of recruitment and retraining, and of course reputational damage as well. Again, that's kind of some of the downsides. Some of the upsides of actually providing quality jobs. That there's a lot of evidence out there, and again, some of this has been very nicely summarized, particularly from an SGB sector perspective in the Andy paper I mentioned earlier on. Engaging with and interacting with workers does create and can create a sense of belonging and a willingness to contribute to kind of a business objectives, including the kind of mission or vision of the business over the long term. It makes it easier to attract and retain talent. And there is a lot of evidence, particularly in customer-facing SGBs, that employee satisfaction has a strong positive correlation with customer loyalty and satisfaction. And finally, particularly as SGBs look to grow and continue their journey, perhaps even beyond the definition of an SGB, and look to raise additional capital in the future, treating employees well, having decent working conditions can actually provide a platform for good growth and attracting the right kind of capital to scale up even further. So that doesn't mean, though, that in every instance it's easy to integrate or straightforward no-brainer to integrate and think about not just measuring, but improving decent work in SGBs. And there's often kind of some key considerations that from the SGB perspective that need to be top of mind. And these are really important for organizations that are either investing in or supporting in SGBs to help find the best fit in terms of measurement methods for understanding the decency of work, but also actions to improve the decency of work over time. So that's really, as I mentioned earlier, balancing the need, what do I need to do as an SGB? What's the minimum required of me? And how do I make sure I do that? And how do I get support to make sure I do that versus kind of what's the nice to do? How do I go beyond compliance and the minimum? And where does that make sense? Where's there a business case? And that's often around kind of trading off the burden of measurement, with the evidence of commercial benefits, which is not always clear or straightforward to try and draw a link between how you treat your employees and your ultimate success as an organization, as a business. And it's quite hard, depending on how the business is and the SGB is keen on quantifying the value of proactive engagement with the workforce. Even in the largest organizations, it's quite hard to put a return on investment or a dollar value of the value of providing decent work. And generally speaking, what I'd say is that there is an interesting, not just practice perspective, a business model perspective. So as workers in general treated as cost or as assets. Of course, priorities for workers may range from kind of ensuring their basic rights are upheld, to improving working conditions, to building careers, to building wealth, and to exercising voice and agency. We'll talk about these again in more detail. I don't know whether the polls have opened. Andy, Amalia, and Farid.
No, Matt, sorry for that. They're not working, so we can just move. Yeah.
No problem. No problem. What I'd love to do is maybe just take two questions then in a row and just hear from some of you. I think, I've talked about some of the main challenges there. I've talked about the definition of decent work and what it is and it isn't, and how to kind of start to situate that within a small and growing business perspective. I'd love to hear from some of you, kind of what are the main challenges you think kind of facing small and growing business who just want to understand as a business owner whether they're providing quality jobs, but also what are the challenges for you as organizations who want to support small and growing businesses to measure and improve job quality. Particularly those who've had experience of this in the past, it would be excellent to hear in your country or context some of the challenges facing SGBs and in your support to SGBs to actually particularly measuring job quality. You are all unmuted, so please either put up your hand or unmute and please share a couple of examples.
Hi, it's Juliana Galvez from Union Social Business. I'll turn on my camera. One of the biggest challenges we have right now is with the information of DANE, the Department of DANE, Statistics in Colombia. Farid, how do you translate that in English? I don't know, but I guess that.
Yeah, I would say the National Department for the Statistics, yeah, like the official statistics organization we have in Colombia.
And it's interesting because they have some information that they show that almost 40% of the people that are employed formally in Colombia are still poor. So it's interesting because employment then, so we always say we have to create jobs, but it's not enough. So creating jobs are not enough. So I think that the difference between creating jobs and creating quality jobs is where you close the gap in terms of inequality and in terms of impact. So it's really interesting. I could share with Farid that information because it's something that as YSB we are working, because most of the companies think and they use the number, I generate 100 employments, I generate 1,000 employments. But when you see these numbers, 40%, it's really a huge number. And I am not talking about the informal sector. I'm talking about the formal sector. So that's something that DANE is giving us the information.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think something we'll get back to later again is, in my mind, there are a lot of metrics floating around about number of jobs supported, number of jobs created, but actually no two jobs are created equally in terms of the quality of those jobs and the benefits they provide. So actually getting a handle on the relative decency of those jobs is actually critical to understanding whether you're having an impact or not, or whether the, yes, sorry, there is a hand up from Natalia, I think.
Thank you, Matt. Just related to what was mentioned before, I think we have a challenge in terms of monitoring and evaluation, because up till now we have indicators such as number of jobs created, right? But we're not asking ourselves if those jobs are actually decent jobs. So I think that there is a huge opportunity there. Not only in terms of measuring and including an additional indicator, but also to actually see how we can reflect that in our context. In Colombia, for instance, I was just surprised to see that decent work includes things that vulnerable population will not be able to actually have. First of all, they have to be formal, they have to think about how to ensure health and social security things, but beyond that they will be facing things such as trainings and how to really make their employees engage. And I think that that's maybe more obvious in big enterprises than in small growing businesses, at least in these vulnerable populations that we work with.
Thanks, Natalia. Yeah, really important point. And I think echoing, going back to seeing the decency of work or job quality, not necessarily as a binary. We often talk about putting people on the pathway towards decent work. And actually the core measurement challenge is, well, okay, what in the given context for that particular target group does better quality jobs look like? And it's very unlikely that that's going to be every element. And in fact, probably even in the most advanced economies in the world, there are very few jobs that can meet all of those aspects of decent work. So it's about contextualizing it. We'll have one more. I think Jennifer, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Matt and Farid. One issue for me is many of the organizations are working with the concept of living income, right? And again, we have to be sure that the job is also supporting the living income gap, or if it's not supporting, what we can do together. There is also an issue of, I would say, monitor job quality and job creation beyond the agricultural sector. However, Central American countries, we are all, based and depend a lot of agriculture, right? So I think that is a mix in between that, the job that we support, the job that is created with the participation of private sector, but also if the opportunity is really helping people, vulnerable youth, women, etc., to close the living income gaps. It is enough, to pay, the rent, to education, access to food, as Natalia said. So what is the type of job we are looking for? And also if we are, alignment, we are aligned in the job creation, indicators with other indicators like income, etc. I think that is also that we need to reflect. And maybe talking more particularly about Nicaragua or even Honduras, the issue of qualified jobs, and how we can also strengthening the environment, to facilitate the access to that type of opportunities for your people.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And yes, we'll pick up on a couple of those kind of axes around how to contextualize decent work in a second. Sol, very quickly, if it'd be great to hear from. I think you've got your hand up as well.
Hi, I want to say something about that. Flavio Linares from Solidaridad, Mesoamerican region. I think the main challenges is regarding to lacking of awareness about what means decent work. That means there is a several dimensions that people don't know. This is in the whole levels, it's happening inclusive with the government agencies, not just for the supply chain organizations. Secondary is the lacking of knowledge about the framework, the law, the framework, which is a national framework and international agreements, and last ILO, for example. And third is the lacking of knowledge for workers about the rights. That means when you said about the how to engagement, how to provide a roadmap to fill that gaps, that means workers don't know about the rights. Of course, they know more about the duties, but not about the rights. And the other thing is the deficit of unemployment. We can see women are more affected than men, but in general, the region are facing lacking of jobs. That's the reason that you can see social phenomena, irregular migration to the United States. So that means lacking opportunities is demanded. But beside that is in parallel, the lacking decent work conditions started with the decent income and decent living wage.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Just in the interest of time, we're going to move on now and be opportunity for discussion in a second. Just to recap some of what you've said and to kind of just emphasize some of the issues and challenges of measuring decent work, and you've really touched on some of those core points. So, yes, there's a lack of awareness. Decent work is sometimes hard to kind of conceptualize in a given context, and the issues are quite complex and quite hidden. It's not really as straightforward when you're measuring some aspects of decent work. You can't ask directly about forced labor, for instance. In some instances, you have to come up with proxy indicators to have a more of a risk-based approach. So they're tricky issues, some of the things. There's often limited capacity and resources to measure. And particularly from a business perspective, it's unclear sometimes how actionable the data is. I speak to one SGB owner who said, well, look, I know I should ask this or find this out for my employees, but I'm worried that if I do that and I find out the answer, I'll have to do something about it, right? Because it's not, measurement is often the first step in action. So there is a kind of an incentive issue sometimes. And most aspects of job quality are actually, let's be clear, or some of them are quite costly to address or improve at the firm level. But what I want to finish with for on the slides is really just ways of conceptualizing decent work and the different axes around which decent work can play out. So it can play out at different levels. We'll talk about that means in a second. It's multi-dimensional, job quality, and it can be examined from different perspectives. And all of you in the comments there have really tried to get to those points actually. So when we talk about measuring decent work, like what's the units of analysis? What level are we talking about? Are we thinking the micro level? Are we conceptualizing measuring decent work at the level of an individual? Say a agriculture wage laborer or a farmer or someone working in a factory who may have one job, but in many instances may have more than one job that they're actually doing to earn an income. Are we measuring at the level of the job, the position that they do themselves? Are we measuring at the level of the workplace, so the given working environment of where someone actually carries out the physical work? Are we measuring at the level of the company, so the business in which people are employed? Or are we looking at the meso level, and that was touched on before? Are we looking at the kind of the particular industry and value chain, or are we looking at the whole sector as agriculture as a whole? Or in fact, are we looking at national systems, e.g. social security, or the level of the economy, the labour market? And decent work can actually play out, and decent work measurement can actually play out across all of these different levels. So being very clear on the kind of unit of analysis, not just what we're trying to measure, but at what level we're trying to measure it, is one important takeaway from I'd like you to kind of think about following the session. The second is that job quality is multidimensional. As I said at the very beginning, job quality, and measuring a job in a particular context is proven to be quite a tricky endeavor, because there's actually no general consensus on a kind of one universe or one set of topics that constitute what job quality is and isn't. So the ILO universe I was showing you earlier is one way of cutting it. It almost seems that everyone has their own way of saying what elements should be part of job quality and shouldn't. Usually it covers things like pay, terms of employment, working environment, work intensity, representation, and voice. But the issue is that data is often missing or really difficult to get for many of these dimensions. And there's trade-offs. So in your comments there, you really importantly mentioned the trade-off between job quality and job quantity, but there's actually trade-offs between different dimensions of decent work. And that has an implication for what we measure. Because if we're just measuring wages or incomes, is our measure of job quality, but of course they can go up. But what if they're going up because people are working double the amount of hours? And that's then causing another problem in job quality. So there's kind of trade-offs and potential tensions between different aspects of job quality. And the way in which that changes over time, so kind of job quality outcomes changes in time, may change in different directions. Some things could get worse, some things could get better. And actually it's quite hard to bring together into a single definitive picture of, is job quality getting better or worse? Well, the evidence often shows it's getting both better and worse at the same time. So it's actually quite hard to not just measure, but interpret and know what to do with. And finally, there's different perspectives on kind of what constitutes a good job. So you can look at those list of 10 decent work deficits. It's very much kind of more of a objective perspective, kind of the, independent of a worker's personal circumstances. These are good, these are bad. But there's also the subjective perspective, the preferences of the worker. And oftentimes, those preferences are determined by their previous job, what they were doing beforehand. So if you have someone who's coming out of maybe very poor working conditions into still bad working conditions, but much better than before, they may have a much better view of a job than someone who's actually got pretty decent working conditions, but maybe having issues in other areas. So kind of looking at the objective perspective and subjective perspective is really important in terms of thinking, well, what matters most to workers? And that actually differs depending on context as well as personal circumstances. So really, this is what I'm going to kind of pause here again and would like to hear from you. What I've tried to do so far today, and this is an introductory lab, it's the first one, is really just set some of those key questions, set some of those key lenses of which we're going to unpack and explore in the future labs. So these are key topics we're thinking about tackling. I'd love to hear whether we're missing any or anything in your context that would really be important to cover in the remaining sessions. So what we want to think about is, great, there's all of this kind of ways to kind of, this is what decent work looks like in theory. what does it look like in practice? How can we actually conceptualize it in our given country or context? What measurement tools can we use? How do we do things like using technology to engage with workers? How do we account for those trade-offs between different dimensions of job quality and the quality versus quantity conundrum we talked about? How do you track and analyze change over time? What are the kind of drivers of and the factors of integrating decent work in, particularly for investor relevant frameworks? And then how do you bring that all together to kind of report to funders on headline key performance indicators? And underpinning that, I guess, was three questions which we should always bear in mind. How do you actually unlock incentives in businesses, in SGBs, to track and report on job quality? So this isn't always something that's imposed from the outside by organizations or investors supporting SGBs, but getting SGBs to kind of drive forward job quality measurement and improvements themselves. Nonetheless, how can organizations help SGBs measure and create high quality jobs? How can we program our own activities? But how to do this in a way that is essentially cost effective, because you can probably imagine this can quickly get quite complex, quite costly, time consuming, but we need to do this in lean ways, in action oriented ways. So let me pause there. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these questions. Are we missing any first thoughts?
Matt, maybe you can actually check the chat box. You have some
Oh,
comments
yes.
and questions over
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. If I check the chat box, I'm sure you can see. Okay. Okay. While I read those, would anyone like to contribute or any reflections on the key topics or the key questions that we'll cover in the remaining labs?
Maybe we can share the results from the poll, Matt, because we sent a new link for them to fill them.
Okay, perfect. Yes, for finding technology fixes.
Yeah, Amalia, please go on.
Excellent. Okay, very interesting. So that does kind of probably validate that last question I had around how to get to lean, right-sized and not too expensive methods, and hopefully not sure where to start, which was the second, and in fact, lack of practical tools are absolutely things that we're going to be addressing in future labs. Brilliant. Okay, that's really useful. In terms of the other questions in the chat, yes, I think those are around kind of informality and particularly engaging not just with businesses, but rules and regulations, so the rules of the game. And absolutely, we'll touch on those, particularly on the thematic sessions, number 5 on rights, respect, and cooperation in the workplace. Mindful of time, what I wanted to do was do two things. One, and we probably don't have time to go into this in detail now, but actually wanted to end each session, each lab with, it can be done, and the good news story, and it can add value. So not just the challenges, but how people have gone about solving them. So this is very quickly did a case study around a farm actually in Nigeria. It's a rice processor that had investment from the UK's Development Finance institution. This was a business with about 200 workers, decided to partner with a third party. Some of you may know them, used to be known as Acumen Lean Data, now known as 60 Decibels, to do a telephone survey of their workers to understand about the worker profile, where they were before, the employment journey, satisfaction, perceptions of security, and suggestions for improvement. So it was very much an employee engagement with an impact lens, or a decent jobs impact lens layered into it. So it confirmed good things around creating new job opportunities and how important these roles were for family incomes. but it also highlighted a number of challenges, particularly around kind of the harmonious relationships with the local community, issues around training, resources to do their job, and long working hours. And actually, as a result of the survey, it was the business who sat down together with the investor to take steps to address some of the issues raised. So kind of offering more training opportunities, resources for staff to improve skills and productivity, policies to improve worker safety, and better integrate the company and the host community, and steps to improve communication between management and staff. And as one worker said, I'm kind of happy that this was the name of the firm, because Choris wants to know how we feel working with them. They should keep doing that. So really, it provided the platform for a much more open dialogue between the entrepreneur, the founder, and their workforce. Happy to share that case study in more detail. It comes from an example I actually worked on with this CDC group. In the last minute, I know we've run out a minute over time. Really wanted to say top 3 takeaways, from this introductory session. I know it's been a lot of me talking this time. Thought it important for us all to get on the same page of what decent work is and isn't, some of the initial frameworks. The remaining sessions are really going to be very much more about your perspective on trying to collectively address some of these questions. But 3 takeaways: decent work is about more and better jobs. Job quality itself is multidimensional. There's trade-offs and tensions between those different aspects of job quality, and you can examine that from different perspectives, both of the worker, subjective, and a kind of more factual, objective perspective. And measurement challenges, let's be clear, and I think this is something we really want to unpack, are not just about capacities and about the tools and about the indicators. There is much to do with incentives for measurement as they are to do with capacities. So the next session we have will be around the investor's perspective, coming up next week. In the meantime, I'd really, would love to hear again, if you had any particular examples. We'd love to kind of hear those of your work in future sessions. But if you want to get in touch to chat and discuss about any of your decent work measurement challenges, we offer an opportunity to basically have a call with me to have one-on-one support specific to your project or organization. So if you are interested in that, please reach out and we can schedule a session either in the coming week or as the learning labs progress, because we really want to help you translate all of what we're talking about here in general and across countries and contexts, but really help you situate to that in your given program or challenge you're facing. So let me pause there. I know we've run a little bit over time, but I wanted to ask for any questions, anything else which you may be wanting to share today.